Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Australian China Institute for Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. And to many, welcome back to our Chinese Australian History Seminar Series. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands we are all sitting today at various locations, and in particular, the Darug people of the Darug Nation, where the Institute is located at our Parramatta South campus, and pay our respect to the First Nations elders, past, present, and emerging. We're very pleased to report that this Chinese Australian History Seminar Series is very popular. I guess that the popularity reflects the general interest that many people want to know about what has happened in this unique and a very important part of Australian history. And it is also a testimony to the speaker, Professor Michael Williams' thorough knowledge of Chinese Australian history and the way he presents as a very fine historian. Today, Professor Michael Williams will talk about a white Australian tested from 1911 to 1936, a topic that constantly requires our reflection. The Q&A session in all previous seminars was always very interesting. So again, as the audience, you are encouraged to post your questions at the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and Michael will answer them at the end of his presentation. Now, please welcome Professor Michael Williams.
Thank you, Jen, for that, and welcome everyone to this fourth in our series on Chinese Australian history. In the previous sessions, we've talked about a range of topics. We've talked about Chinese Australian involvement in the discovery of Australia. We've talked about gold. We've talked about artisans and merchants. And last session, we talked about the fall of the Qing and the creation of the Republic of China, how this influenced and was influenced by events and peoples in Australia. And so today I'll be talking about the period after 1911, but up to this point, we've talked about a number of themes, and I want to just focus on two themes that's come out of the lectures so far. The first, of course, comes from the title of this series, a reflective history. So Chinese Australia, reflective history. And by this, I mean that much of what we think we know of Chinese Australian history is determined by the present, by contemporary events and ideas reaching back and manipulating that history. So this is a theme that I've dealt with, and we'll find that in this particular period, that's even more important than in the previous topics. And part of this, an essential part of this, is the White Australia policy. And here I'm going to dwell on the idea of the White Australia policy whitewashing Australian history, being responsible, among other things, to reducing Chinese Australian history to images of the gold miners and market gardeners, or perpetual migrants and victims of a White Australia policy. And so this is part of the theme we'll be discussing today. Now, this whitewashing, this is in fact when it all happens. It's in this period of the 1920s and 1930s, when links with China, international business, even Chinese opera, diversity, adaptation and acceptance, all of this is increasingly ignored. There's a gradual forgetting that people of Chinese heritage had a strong part of Australian colonial history. And there's a learning to accept or to think of Chinese Australians as something exotic, an aberration in what is now known as a white Australia, what people consider to be the norm of Australia. And so Chinese Australian history is no longer seen as an inherent aspect of what is now an increasingly whitewashed Australian history. And yet at the same time, it's in this period that, in fact, the proportion of Australian-born people of Chinese heritage grows to be greater than it had ever been before. This is just partly because of a decline in numbers as people return to China and new people cannot arrive, as many as before, as a result of the White Australia policy. And so even as Chinese Australians are kind of being squeezed out of the history, they're actually growing in terms of being Australian, at least insofar as being Australian born. So 1911 to 1936 is the shortest period in years that I'm dealing with in the series of lectures, but it's one that perhaps has the greatest number of changes and transformations, and to look at them in both China and Australia. In China, this is a period when the Chinese Republic goes through many tribulations, the warlords, a resurgent nationalist party, and invading Japanese empire. And these China-based developments greatly influenced the thinking and actions of many people in Australia. In Australia itself, the early promise of Labor governments is replaced by an increasing bureaucratisation. The British Empire itself is mortally wounded by World War I, and this leaves Australia feeling increasingly isolated. But this fear of isolation actually causes psychologically a doubling down on a narrowness of identification. Australia in this period seeks to identify itself even more strongly as a white Australia within the British Empire. And this idea reaches its height, this feeling reaches its height in this period. So, white Australia, psychological aspects of it reaches some extremes that even the pineapples are considered better sold if they're white Australian. I'm not too sure what exactly the benefit of that was, but this just shows you some of the extremes to which this idea of striving for whiteness takes on. And this is something that's reflected in how Chinese Australians have to deal with the history in this period. So in this lecture, I'll talk about four main themes. The first is the bureaucratisation of the white Australia policy itself. And then I'll also talk about the evolution of what can be called a Hua Chao pattern. Hua Chao meaning sojourners, overseas Chinese, the idea of the pattern of life that most people who identify as Chinese Australians dealt with. And it's important to remember that although I'm separating these two things as themes, it's the interaction between these two things that makes the history in this period. It's of most significant. So I'll be dealing with them separately, but always in terms of how they interact with each other. I'll also talk a little bit about the choices people made and had, because the diversity of people can be obscured by labels. And so Chinese Australian is a label like any other, and it meant different things to different people, and not everybody who we today will identify as Chinese Australian necessarily thought of themselves in that way. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about the ongoing theme of the reflections, and how I'll give an example of how this period of history is being shaped by our contemporary perspectives and concerns. So to begin, the bureaucratisation of the white Australia policy. So in the previous lecture, I talked about the Immigration Restriction Act and the Dictation Test that was introduced in 1901. But it's important to remember that this single act was only one part of a raft of measures designed to make Australia white again, to coin a phrase. So, but nevertheless, it was an important part. And in the period that we're now talking about, from 1911 through to 1936, the white Australia policy quickly settled down into a very ponderous administrative machine. And it's within that framework that Chinese Australians, or at least those who wish to travel to China and back, were required to live for many generations. And it's this dynamic, this interaction with the bureaucracy that influenced many people's lives to a great degree. Now, if the white Australia policy has a face, this would be the face. This is Ashley Hunt. For the first 20 years or so of the Immigration Restriction Act, he was the secretary of the various departments that were in charge of the administration. Sometimes Home Secretary, sometimes External Affairs. The department name changed, but he remained the secretary for the first 20 years, and he built up the bureaucracy. And it's this bureaucratic machine that he instituted that pretty well stayed the same right through to at least the 1950s, when the Dictation Test itself was finally abolished, and then a gradual winding down of the white Australia policy thereafter. And so he's the bureaucratic head, the face of the white Australia policy, if anyone can be designated that way. But as I said, the white Australia policy was more than just an immigration policy and a fake dictation test. It was more generally a striving for whiteness, a desire to make Australia as white as possible. And this has many aspects, and I'll just mention a few here, some of them contrary to the aims of those that moulded the white Australia policy. But most importantly was the psychology. And I'll give an example of that that comes from 1911. So 1911 was the year, apart from the fall of the Qing, it was also the year when the Northern Territory was transferred from the jurisdiction of South Australia to that of the Commonwealth. So naturally, in 1911 in Darwin, they had a ceremony, and a flag raising ceremony. And at the ceremony were assembled the various elements of the Darwin community, which is largely a white population, a very significant Chinese population, and also, of course, the indigenous population. And they're all gathered around to see the flag raised, when suddenly someone or a group of people protested and said that this flag could not be raised because it had actually been made by Chinese. And so they literally halted the ceremony and ran around until they could find another flag, an older flag, whose main virtue seemed to be that, in fact, they didn't know who made that flag. So they raised that instead. And this caused quite a lot of stir and a lot of laughter, actually, in the southern states, and they were all labelled White Australia faddists. And this story illustrates both the extremes to which this white Australianness could go, and also its limits. I mean, this kind of reached the limits. So there was a consensus about white Australia, but for many people, this was perhaps going a little bit too far. So it did show that sometimes it could go too far, but it certainly went a long way. And another example of just how far it went can be seen by an encyclopedia written in 1925, the Australian Encyclopedia, 2-volume work. And under its heading for Chinese, it simply said, Chinese in Australia, see immigration restriction. So by 1925, as far as the writers of this encyclopedia were concerned, the only role of Chinese in Australia was to simply be restricted. It gave, under immigration restriction, it gave a potted history of the Chinese in Australia simply in terms of mounting restrictions and discriminations leading up to the White Australia policy in 1901. No other entry anywhere in the book about Chinese in Australia. And this is just illustrative of the mentality they were seeking and successfully seeking to establish in terms of how to define Australianness. Excuse me. But there were many other things going on. So another example is a trek to Queensland. And by this I mean there was quite a significant population of Chinese people living in the Northern Territory, and as there had been in Queensland. And up to 1901, Queensland, like many of the states in Australia, had a poll tax that attempted to limit the number of Chinese people entering their state. And that included people trying to cross from the Northern Territory into Queensland. But with Federation, with the establishment of a tariff bill, among other things, those kind of internal borders were no longer possible. And this meant that quite a number of people could move then quite freely from the Northern Territory into Queensland. So to many Queenslanders' horror, their Chinese population actually began to increase. And of course, part of the reason why, in fact, they wanted to move across to Queensland was that Darwin in the Northern Territory was doing what a lot of people were doing around Australia, trying to squeeze people out of their jobs. That is to say, make jobs available only for white people and to not allow others to work. So, for example, fishing licenses were withdrawn in Darwin for people who were not designated white. And this is one among many reasons why people began to move into Queensland. In Queensland itself, corn growing in Atherton was dominated by Chinese Australians. And this, again, there was many efforts made over a number of years to squeeze them out of that industry. And this kind of patterning happened right around Australia. In Queensland, again, they even instituted a dictation test of their own to try and squeeze people out of the banana and sugar growing areas. This was designed to stop not only Chinese, but also people of South Sea Islander heritage from growing or making a profit. They could work for a wage, but they weren't allowed to make a profit by growing their own crops. Again, this is an example of a law that was passed. In reality, it didn't necessarily have that much effect. I mean, there's a difference between a law and how that's enforced. But nevertheless, it shows the mentality at this time. And it's also interesting to consider the exceptions to this rule, and we'll talk more about how this develops over time. So we all know that the image of Chinese as market gardeners is very strong. And it's in this period that, in fact, a greater percentage of Chinese people become market gardeners than ever before. And that's precisely because it's perceived as a Chinese job, which means there's no harassment. People are not only allowed to work in those jobs, but even new arrivals coming into Australia are allowed to start taking up jobs. And we'll talk about how that comes about as the development of the bureaucracy of the White Australia policy develops. And another example of exception to the White Australia policy was the pearl shell industry. Now, I use this picture because it's not actually Chinese in this picture, it's mostly because Japanese. Japanese people dominated the actual diving of the pearl shell industry, which was becoming very important in Northern Australia. Thursday Island, Darwin and Broome. It was quite a major industry in the first half of the 20th century. And so I just want to remind you that although there were many Chinese involved in the pearl shell industry, it was mostly as owners of ships or dealing with buying the shells or working in shops in these locations where the pearl shell industry was important. So it's a reminder that, of course, the White Australia policy affected other people besides Chinese. Chinese were the majority, the major people affected, but there were a number of other people classified as non-white that were also impacted. And also, I thought this picture was a good reminder that sometimes stereotypes are true. This guy in his pith helmet is obviously the stereotype of a colonial at that time, and obviously he's dressed for the occasion. So despite all these other aspects of the White Australia policy, and there were quite a number of them, the main mechanism was nevertheless the Immigration Restriction Act and the Dictation Test. And it's important to realise that one of the reasons why it was became so bureaucratic is because it was continually modified. And it was continually modified in order to adjust to a continual pushing that went on, mainly from the Chinese community, not exclusively, but very largely from the Chinese community. It was continually pushing back and trying to get to fight against these restrictions. And they did this in a number of ways. And the first certainly happened very early on, even before the beginning of our period here, in the first few years of the Immigration Act. And that was because the Immigration Restriction Act had a clause in it that said people who were resident in Australia before 1901 could remain in Australia. So this was the known as being they could claim domicile status. But at first, Attlee Hunt was very keen to make a very narrow definition of what domicile meant. To him, that meant you lived in Australia, that was your permanent home, you had wife, you had family, you had assets in Australia. Now, if his definition had been successfully carried out over a period of years, it would have decimated the population very quickly, and of course certainly would have wiped out the vegetable market gardening industry in Australia. There was much lobbying went on, and in the end, they had to very much modify that policy, and they instituted instead a policy whereby domicile was very broadly defined, and basically people were issued with what was then called certificates exempting the Dictation Test, and by and large, anybody who was resident in Australia before 1901 could get one of those certificates, which was effectively a resident return visa and allowed people to leave and to return relatively easily over many years, as long as they went through the bureaucratic procedures. Part of the kind of quid pro quo for that, that relaxing of those domicile rules was that the wives of merchants, which had been a specific clause within the Immigration Restriction Act, were suspended. Wives of merchants still were able to come, but under other provisions, which I'll talk about later on. But this was meant to be kind of like a balancing to try and make sure that the numbers did not rise or dropped rather than rise. Now, there are many, many other modifications in the Act, and most of these were a result of court cases. And the reason for so many court cases was you have to remember that the Dictation Test itself was a crime. To fail that test was a criminal offence. It meant it had to go before the courts, and the courts took this kind of criminal laws quite seriously, and they wanted to make sure that the provisions were strictly held to. And this meant even things like 50 words. So the Dictation Test in the original Act was to be of 50 words. And because it didn't take long for some smart lawyer to realise that sometimes the number of words read were in fact a little less or a little more than 50 words. And the courts, once they were made aware of that, simply declared that particular giving of the Dictation Test to be illegitimate and allowed people to pass the test. And so, of course, all they did was change the Act so as to institute that the Dictation Test should be at least 50 words. And it also meant that for many, many years, there were bureaucrats who were set the task of having to count the number of words very carefully within these passages to make sure that they were always at least or a little bit more than 50 words each. And so, by and large, these various modifications, and there were quite a number of them, that were instituted due to court cases or lost court cases as far as the customs immigration was concerned, were designed, of course, to make it easier for these customs bureaucrats. And just a reminder that I'm use the word customs. Well, it's the Immigration Protection Act. There was no immigration department. These were not immigration officials. They were customs officials. They dealt with tariffs on tobacco. They searched ships for contraband of various kinds at the same time as they looked for Chinese or other non-white people coming into Australia. So there was a mixture that doesn't exist today. So this bureaucracy I'm talking about, the White Australia bureaucracy, for historians is of course a treasure trove. It's a mass of documents, and it's a mass of documents created by all the administration that was necessary for a certain class of people, and it wasn't for everybody, a certain class of people had to go through it if they were wanted to leave or to return to Australia. Most important document, as I've mentioned before, is the certificate exempting from the dictation test, which was by and large given to those people who were already in Australia, some 30,000 people of Chinese origin, Chinese birth in Australia before 1901. And they could use these to go back and forth. And many people used them to go back and forth to China on numerous occasions throughout their working lives. There was also a very similarly named certificate of exemption. So it's not the same thing, but this certificate of exemption was a temporary entry, and these were for new people who had not been resident in Australia, people coming into Australia, perhaps a merchant, perhaps a student, perhaps a wife of a merchant, various other things. They were usually given for 6 months, but they could be extended. And they were an important part of the immigration bureaucracy over the next 20 or 30 years. Birth certificates were also used, and here we need to know that people of Australian birth technically were perfectly free as any other Australian citizen to move in and out of Australia without passports. Passports were only gradually coming into play. Nevertheless, they were being harassed, they were being stopped on the boats, they were being accused of not being who they were, possibly they weren't born in Australia. And so in order to get around these problems, people took to carrying their birth certificates and getting them endorsed by the officials before they left Australia. Or sometimes people, even though they were Australian born, simply took out a certificate exempting the dictation test the same as any Chinese born person did. So there was very much a mixing and overlapping here of people that normally were Australian citizens. So this was all about identification. Identification was done with photographs, it was done with handprints, later on modified a little bit to thumbprints. It involved police checks, character checks, letters, photos, handprints, as I said. It also involved trying to find people who had entered Australia illegally, who managed to jump ship or smuggled in or come in on false documents. And so the rewards were given. And of course, when you have a reward, £10 being a reasonably substantial amount of money, you also had what can be seen as dobbin letters. Letters were commonly written in the files, often scribbled on little bits of paper, saying things like, if you look at the ship that docks in Melbourne tonight or next week, there'll be 10 people hidden away in the cargo. And these letters were often written by rival smuggling gangs. So they had different groups and they were trying to sabotage the efforts of another group, because it's all, of course, a money-making proposition. And so the customs often relied on these kind of informants, and that's why they often paid their money. Now, as the bureaucracy developed, there was also categorizations of people. So the substitutes, assistants, students were three of the major categories. And what happened was that as people wanted to enter Australia, various jobs were categorized as Chinese, and you could substitute. You could say you wanted to go away for a number of years back to China. You could bring in someone to look after your business, or you needed assistance. And increasingly, people also began to bring in their children to study, almost always males, and they would study, sometimes often elite schools. And so quite a whole class of people were educated in Australia in this period as well. And very often got good educations and then went off and used those educations to work in Hong Kong and Shanghai. We'll talk more about that also a little bit later. So all of this, reports, investigations, trials, and massive documents that allows people to really see what was going on in this period of time. Now, what this meant was, of course, there were large, for anybody travelling back and forth from Australia, people with Chinese birth, anyway, non-white birth origin, there were delays. They were subject to official whims. I mean, the officials had tremendous discretion here. There's political interference as well. Very often bribes, dob-ins, as I said, interpreters had to be used. People spent time in jail. People often had to pay bonds. So rather than spending time in jail, if it was a case of being identified, which could take some time, you could pay a £100 bond and then be let off the ship and wait until your case was heard, and then the bond could be returned once it was determined you were who you said you were. People, of course, had to return. Very often kept on the ship and had to return back to Hong Kong. There were ships musters whenever the ship stocked in port, ship searches, and raids on market gardens in particular, as customs officials began to look for people who had supposedly entered Australia illegally. So all of this meant two major social implications for people in Australia. First off, most obviously, that basically Chinese Australians were second-class citizens. Regardless of whether they're Australian born or not, they were subject to these restraints, these restrictions, and this control of officialdom and the need to go through a kind of bureaucratic procedures that other Australians simply did not have to do. And this lasted, say, for many generations, right through from 1901 through to the 1950s and beyond. And there's also this increasing ghettoization of occupations. So as I said, we have the stereotype of Chinese as market gardeners. It's in this period of time that begins to become a reality because certain jobs are recognised as being Chinese, and so people are pretty well restricted to working in those jobs. Market gardens, various Chinese stores in the Chinatowns, cafes later on. And the irony of this is that this led to a certain level of exploitation, as you might expect. People who are come to Australia who have limited jobs means that they can't easily leave those jobs, or if they owe money because they've been smuggled in or their fare has been paid in some other way, they're needing to work for an employer who can, of course, then exploit them to a certain degree. And the irony of this is that this was precisely what the Labor Party and the Australian working class said that they wanted to, why they wanted to institute the White Australia policy in the first place, was to simply say, well, Chinese are going to work cheaply. We can't have them. They're not fair that they work and compete on a cheaper level with other workers. And yet here, the very bureaucracy of the White Australia policy is in fact creating the conditions for labour exploitation and forcing people to work cheaper than they might otherwise have wanted to do. So all of this, of course, generated a certain amount of what you can call resistance. And at first there was much political lobbying, particularly by prominent merchants, Chinese merchants in Australia. They lobbied to get things changed, lobbied for the domicile status to be relaxed, lobbied for merchants, for wives to come, lobbied for a variety of things. Over a period of time, this lobbying was mainly done, officially at least, by Chinese consuls. So the Republic of China sent a number of consuls, and they tried very hard to make things easier for their citizens, and very often they found themselves also having to take care of Australian citizens as well, something they pointed out on many occasions, that they in fact were dealing with all people of Chinese heritage regardless of their birth or nationality. Another form of resistance was, of course, smuggling and forging of documents. These documents are, of course, easy for people to substitute, to try and bring in people and claim Australian birth or previous domicile. And of course, this led to greater inspections, even more documents, more mustering of passengers. All the kind of bureaucracy was intensified in order to play the game, as it were, between Chinese Australians and white bureaucracy. More raids on market gardens, and as a result, officials were given increasing powers to institute and to enforce this administration. And on occasions, there was quite a deal of public sympathy. Despite the consensus of the White Australia policy, in individual cases, particularly wives with children or other people who had simply become part of the community over many years, attempts by the bureaucrats to expel people often resulted in very sympathetic hearings in the newspapers and in the public domain. A contradiction that officials always had to deal with then, as they do sometimes today. So you've got to remember then that for officials, of course, all this smuggling, false papers and so forth merely demonstrated the kind of criminal tendencies that they thought justified these restrictions in the first place. And the idea of the cunning Chinese was a trope that was often appeared in the newspapers. But for the Chinese community itself, of course, this was all about maintaining the family and business connections that had long been established long before 1901. So dealing with the White Australia bureaucracy for most people of Chinese origin meant that they had to deal with this on a personal and family, community, as well as political level. And this pattern, what we can call the Hua Chao pattern, the overseas Chinese pattern, the sojourner pattern, is a pattern that's very clear to us precisely because of the bureaucracy that we have. But what we need to, of course, we always remember is that this is a pattern that existed long before. So we should look at the pattern in terms of its continuity, in terms of its evolution, and in terms of its growth. And we'll look at these three aspects, but also we need to look at what the pattern was to some extent, particularly as it affected the villages in China, women, and also how it was affected by the decline in numbers. Because over this period is the greatest decline in numbers of the overall Chinese Australian population since Chinese began to arrive in Australia from the Gold Rush period. So continuity. So people had always regularly returned to their families in China. So the idea of coming to Australia, working for a period, going back and coming back again was a regular part of the pattern. It had been from the 19th century. The sending of money, remittances back home to the family is very important. The building of houses and new houses was also, had always taken place, although now the houses that we mostly see in the villages now were ones built in this period, in the 20s and 30s, more substantial, more concrete and so forth, but there had always been houses being built. Donations to the villages were being done. Many of the buildings, many of the clinics, many of the schools are being built with money sent from Australia and from around the diaspora. And of course, the aim, the idea of retiring in China, even after a working life in a place such as Australia, was always going on. So all these elements are continuity. They increase and they evolve in various ways, but they are something that has been going on for generations. So the evolution involved things like sending children to the village. Now, people had always been born in Australia and always, some of them had been sent back to the villages to be educated or to be looked after. But in this period, that's happening more and more, simply because there are more and more children and more Australian-born children as a result of wives, intermarriage and so forth. And so we get quite a number of children spending time in the villages before returning to Australia. And this is a to and forth, resulting in quite a range of people who did speak Chinese, didn't speak Chinese, spoke Chinese well, didn't speak Chinese well, spoke English well, didn't speak English well, are regarded, every variation you can think of. And so people brought to Australia to be educated, they also sent back to China to be educated. Smuggling had always taken place ever since there were poll taxes, but again, in this period, smuggling and the syndicates and the evolution of the system gets more and more complex, more and more involved. And this can be seen as a resistance to the immigration and the White Australia policy. It can also be seen as exploitation, as it often was for various people that were involved. But it also can be seen as all within the family, helping the family in the villages, helping the business in Australia, helping people to do what they'd always done, which is to say to travel, to earn, and to return. Another evolution that's very important at this period is the idea of identity. The Republic has been established, and the idea of a Chinese nation, of someone being a Chinese national, is taking place, particularly in the newer generation. Previous to this, people had thought of themselves as being from a village, or a particular dialect, a particular family. Increasingly, people are also seeing themselves as being Chinese or Australian or Chinese Australian. The Kuomintang is a particularly nationalist party, is of course pushing this idea of being of the Chinese nation. Chinese consuls are pushing this. And as Japan begins to rise as a threat to China, so too does the idea of people being Chinese nationals as opposed to Japanese and Japanese empire. Australian-born people, of course, have a choice. Do they identify as Chinese? Do they identify as Australian? Do they identify as something in between? This is all happening in this period. Now, before I move on, I just want to explain then, of course, just to identify why people wanted to come to Australia. You can see here's a table that I've converted to Mexican dollars. So it's all earnings per month in Mexican dollars, the currency of China at the time. And you can see in the 1930s, the potential earnings or market garner is quite substantial compared to, say, a teacher back in China. And so, of course, the incentive to earn in Australia, particularly when southern China is going through political and social disruptions, bandits and various other disruptions, is quite high. Now, I'm talking about growth. What I mean is that, of course, things don't stay the same. There is a decline in numbers, But in fact, there's quite a lot of growth, particularly on the business level among Chinese Australians. One of them is a shipping line. The Chinese Australian merchants attempt to establish a shipping line. They're quite ambitious to run between China and Australia. This unfortunately fails, mainly to do with World War I and the confiscation of shipping at that time, also competition from Japanese lines. They're more successful when it comes to establishing department stores. And this is an output of a very successful banana importation. The Wing San, for example, which is still there, the building's still there in Campbell Street. They make money from banana importations, also by sending remittances, by taking a percentage of remittances for people who, as they send the money back to China. And these four businessmen and their families ultimately established what are known as the Big Four department stores, which are still, the buildings can still be seen there in Shanghai. They're quite famous in Shanghai, but these were all established in the 1920s and 1930s and were some of the wealthiest and most advanced businesses in China, particularly in Shanghai. Not only as department stores, but also textile mills and so forth, banking and insurance industries as well. Now this business, this growth in this business, of course, greatly affected people in Australia. It gave people opportunities for jobs. They could work in Hong Kong, they could work in Shanghai. People, by and large, began to move their capital out of Australia and their skills out of Australia, where they were not really appreciated. Branches of these stores did remain in Australia, but they tended to be small branches in comparison to what was happening in China, particularly Hong Kong and Shanghai. And this meant that while this trade between Australia and China was in fact growing, at least as far as the Chinese Australian communities were concerned, it didn't in fact have much impact on Australia in general, because Australia still continued to insist on trade with the British Empire. And even during the Depression, when it tried desperately to increase trade with China, really couldn't get beyond dealing with the white enclaves in Shanghai, and never really was able to establish good trade relations. It never really tried to work with its own Chinese Australian community to establish this. So just to talk a little bit about this pattern that I'm talking about, this heart chart pattern. The essence of the pattern was the idea of returning home with glory. That is to say, you go overseas, you earn money. Again, it could be Australia, it could be Hawaii, it could be California, it could be Peru. Many places around the world, you earn your money, and then when you return with glory. You return with money to show how successful you are. And that means strong interaction with the villagers. And this could take place on a number of levels. Obviously with the family, helping the family build new houses and educate children. This is very important. But also building things, consumerism. One of the more prominent buildings built right throughout southern China were the Daliao, these tower houses. They varied in their style right around the districts, depending on where people were from. But the idea was they were, in a sense, they would affect defensive structures designed to, in fact, protect a wealthy person from bandit attacks. Hence, they kind of look a little bit like fortifications. But in reality, they were, of course, also displays of wealth. They were, of course, telling bandits, "This is where we are. We are very wealthy." So a little bit of a contradictory messages being sent there, but nevertheless, very important, and just a very illustrative aspect of the pattern. People also spend a lot of money on schools, and these are modern schools designed to teach modern education and to encourage China and people in the villages to get the best education they could in order to benefit their society. And this also meant, of course, a strong interaction, as I've said before, with the colonial aspects of China, which particularly was Shanghai and Hong Kong. And there, people who had an education in these schools in the villages or in Australia and elsewhere could go there to get jobs, prestige jobs, jobs that were in between jobs that were modern, often working for European firms and businesses, quite wealthy, and which involved their ability to deal with both a European and a Chinese world. At the same time that this growth is going on, this interaction, this intensity of action, this movement of capital and so forth is going on, there's of course a decline in numbers. And this is particularly so because as the aging, or now mainly market gardeners, the aging market gardeners, those that have been in Australia since before 1901, age and return, and they're not replaced. And so the pool of people in Australia begins to get smaller and smaller and smaller, particularly if those are going back to live in China by and large. Now, one interesting aspect that we need to look at is the role of women. So I've mentioned before that there were women, of course, many people marrying Chinese men in Australia, many Australian-born children as a result of that, because most women were still back in the villages. That is to say, wives who always stayed in the villages. These were the women that were being, the money was being sent to. These were women that were being visited regularly by people when they went back home. And of course, women in that role were changing. They were changing because China was changing. Modernity meant that women should be freer, more equal. But it also meant that they were in control. They were getting the money. They were educating the children. They were investing the money. They were buying the rice land. And this, of course, as you can imagine, meant some resentment on the part of men. And this is one interesting account of women. He called them Gold Mountain women, meaning that they were women who were associated with men who were overseas and sending money back. And he said that they were speaking fancy vocabularies, having wasteful and arrogant manners, wearing modern clothing and much jewellery. They go once every 3 days to Sheki, to the county capital in Zhongshan. Every piece of clothing is tailored. Every thread and shoes are bought in the market. And this is because, of course, there's a tremendous consumerism going on here. The money is mainly coming from overseas. It's coming into the villages. They're not producing things, they're buying things. They're using the money to buy things, and the women are in control. They have to go to the markets because there is no one else to go for them. They're in control while the men, their fathers, their husbands, their sons are away. And so the role of women within society is changing quite a lot. And this, of course, is being noted, not always in a positive way by some. So we need to look at the numbers to some extent. So these numbers are based on analysis of New South Wales figures. In Australia, there had been originally some 30,000 people of China-born people in Australia before 1901, and this declined to less than 10,000 by the end of this period, the 1930s. In New South Wales, I've done an analysis of the certificates of exemption and can give a bit of a breakdown of the exact figures. So there were some 10,000 Chinese people in New South Wales in 1901. And we know that 4,800 of them took out certificates of exemption from the Dictation Test, but did not return to Australia. So these are certificates that were never brought back. So that number of people left Australia at some point and never returned. We also know there's some 2,000 Chinese burials in Sydney. And we also know that by about 1947, there was less than 2,000 people living in New South Wales who had been in Australia since 1901. So that means, on a conservative estimate, some 60% of the pre-1901 generation returned to their villages on a permanent basis to retire, whatever. And the men, about half of the rest died in Sydney, and another half remained until their advanced old age. Now, that of course means a decline in numbers, but within that decline, there is some renewal going on. And as I've emphasised before, there is an increasing number of Australian-born Chinese. So although the numbers are falling, more and more people are actually being born and continue to identify themselves, although we don't know exactly the percentage, identify themselves as part of that Chinese-Australian community. There's also the numbers coming into Australia under certificates of exemption. So between 1902 and 1946, some 6,400 people from China enter Australia. And some 2,200 of them or more actually managed to stay pretty much right through to the 1950s. That is, they stay until changes in citizenship laws allow them to take out citizenship and to stay in Australia permanently. So that's a remarkable 1 in 3 managed to convert their temporary residency into something a bit more permanent. And they managed to do this by continually extending those certificates of exemption. And because all this changes in the 1930s, late 1930s with the war, and refugee numbers begin to boost numbers again. And I'll talk about that, of course, in the next lecture when we cover the period of World War II. But up until the 1930s, then you've got overall decline, but some renewal and some continuation of the community based on both people being born in Australia and some people managing to come and remain under various circumstances. But also we need to remember that this label that we've been using, as Chinese Australian, is a label like any other. Nothing's fixed in stone. And people change their attitudes, change their identity with time and circumstances. So for many Australians, many born in Australia, Australia was too white, and it was a turn to China was very natural. Even for those people who were perhaps had limited Chinese, they would still rather go live in Hong Kong and Shanghai, where they could use their English to get good jobs and to be dealt with on some level of equality, rather than be treated as second-class citizens, as they often were within Australia. And so these choices are influenced by changing local as well as international factors. And this is all part of the history, which unfortunately we don't have a great deal of time to go into in great detail, but this, I just want to suggest to you that there's a lot more complexity there than I can say today. Because one of these major choices is an enhanced sense of Chineseness. And that particularly comes with this growing threat from the Japanese Empire. So people within Australia in particular begin to get more and more worried that they can see things happening. And this takes place particularly in the 1930s. And again, most of that will take place, I'll talk about in the next lecture. I just want to remember the choices people had. And I'll give you a couple of examples just to show the range here. So for most people, it was a sense of being in between. There was a choice of assimilation. Of course, Australia was a very assimilationist attitude in those times, and many people had the choice of assimilating and often did. And in this period, some people changed their names. Some people stopped telling their children that their grandfather or great-grandfather had once been Chinese. And many people now are looking at their family history and realising for the first time that they actually do have Chinese ancestors. Often depending on the language, whether you were able to learn the language. Some people did, some people didn't. Some people just were monolinguals. And this, of course, affected how they could interact. Of course, it depended on who you married, what dialect you were. People were still identifying by dialect, and it's often influenced who people married or didn't marry. Now, it's interesting to look at one of the designations that the Chinese Residents of Australian Association used. So in 1931, this was a merchants association, one of the early associations that was beginning to kind of trying to warn Australia about the dangers from the Japanese Empire. And these were merchants that had been born in Australia, but they'd lived in Australia for many, many years, most of their working life. But they still designated themselves as guests. They considered themselves to be guests or felt constrained to consider themselves as guests within Australia. But what about people who were born in Australia, such as Vivian Chow? Now, Vivian Chow, I'm going to use him as one example. Was Australian born in Lismore, grew up in Lismore. His father had been a very successful merchant, and he was a writer. He grew up writing better in English. He couldn't really converse in Chinese very well. And he wrote a short story called What Happened to Riley. Now, this short story, which can be seen to be actually the first piece of Chinese-Australian literature written in English. Previously, I've talked about The Poison of Polygamy, which was written by a Chinese-born person who came to Australia. His family had been involved in Australia for a long time, who wrote in Chinese. This one, on the other hand, is written in English by an Australian-born Chinese. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the story, and it's a spoiler alert, so if you want to read the story for yourself, then you should mute for the next 2 minutes. But basically, the interest of this story is that it's set in China. It's set during in the Chinese warlord army in the north, and there's two people meet, a Chinese intelligence officer of the army and a British spy. British spy is arrested and they're brought together. And in their discussion, it turns out that both these men are Australians. One is a Chinese Australian born in Australia. The other is also born in Australia, but typically at that time had considered himself to be British. When he's left outside Australia, he would have been considered a British subject. So the two have a confrontation, and in the confrontation, the Chinese Australian kills the British heritage Australian. It's a duel rather than a straight up murder, but nevertheless, he kills him with animosity. And the reason for that is very interesting. He tells in the story an account, which I'm assuming is something that did actually happen to Vivian Chow. That is to say, he tells the story of having grown up in Australia, felt himself to be quite comfortable in Australia, until such time as he fell in love with a white girl. And then was shocked and horrified to find that the father of that white girl was never, under any circumstances, going to allow his daughter to marry someone of Chinese descent. And this greatly hurt and antagonized the protagonist in the story, and my assumption is Vivian Chow as well. And so Vivian expressed his hostility in a quite interesting way. One passage I'll read to you. It's in the What Happened to Riley. The world wants only one sort of Chinese, a humble, meek, ignorant fellow, soaked with opium and mad upon gambling. A clean-minded, clean-bodied, active-brained Chinese spells the doom of white world dominion, and that the white men have been clever enough to realise. So to me, this is an example of some of what's happening. I mean, you've got Chinese Australians are making choices, and we don't often hear about the choice to simply chuck it all in and be hostile, and to realise that this is an oppression that's going on. This racism is not to be borne. We kind of, our sources don't allow us to see what's going on. We get too much of the polite toleration of a level of racism that today we would find quite intolerable. Now, I'm going to find this is the fourth theme that I want to talk about, this like reflections. I want to discuss then how contemporary perspectives changing the history. I've mentioned this before in other examples about Amoy, Laming Flat and other things, how our influences of the present influence our view of the history. Here, I'm going to talk about there's two main perspectives that I think people have today when they look back on the history. One is to see Chinese Australians as hardworking victims, and the other to see them as Australian nationalists. Now, the first emphasises both discrimination, but also perseverance and success of individuals and families. And of course, it's very popular with family history researchers to discover an ancestor who was a successful merchant or established a family, and to realise that they did this under hard circumstances of racism and other discrimination. Naturally, you want to promote this as being part of the stereotype of how hardworking Chinese Australians are, but it's not the whole story. It's just part of the story, and it's a good part of the story, not to be denied. But you've got to look at things in a broader way if you want to see the whole picture. The other thing that's become more popular has been to focus on Anzacs and to identify people of Chinese heritage in their national service. Again, a very worthwhile thing to do, but something that's not quite the full story. So I'll just talk about one example, just to give you an idea of what I mean. Much has been made of Billy Singh, who was a famous sniper during World War I, well known at the time, obviously of Chinese descent. His father was from China, and he's been promoted recently as a good example of a Chinese Anzac, as he is, and a new memorial has been built for him in the cemetery. But I just want to point out that in 1943, for example, in his obituaries, there was no mention of his Chinese background. Now, you can take that for what it means. It means that they didn't want to mention it, but they knew about it. They didn't care. He didn't identify as Chinese. Who knows? But it's just pointing out that that was not considered something to be played upon in 1943. In modern accounts, which does, of course, emphasize his Chinese background, there's no mention, or very rarely is there mention, of his union background. Billy Singh was a very strong unionist. He was the kind of person who gave out how to vote Labor Party, how to vote for the Labor Party at elections and so forth. The union was very strongly represented at his funeral in 1943. And so I'm just saying that if we're going to try and use people as poster boys for particular reasons, particular contemporary perspectives, we should be respectful of a person and try to encourage and try to look at the whole of that person to realise that simply being a poster boy for Chinese Australians isn't really the only thing in Billy Singh's life. There was more to his life than that. That was an important aspect, no doubt, but the history requires us to look more broadly. So I'm saying it's of limited historical value to focus just on the Anzacs as a kind of racism proofing, a kind of a highlighting and a kind of a reverse assimilation. It's very favoured by museums and Facebook and media, people that like to have kind of an easy hook to get the history across to people. And it's important and it's not to be denied, but it overlooks as much as it reveals. It overlooks agency, it overlooks people choosing not to be involved in imperialist wars. It overlooks the hostility evinced by Vivian Chow, who was for a while an intelligence officer in the Chinese army, not in the Australian army. And these kind of things don't always fit these modern perspectives, but in terms of history, we need to be aware of them. It's very assimilationist in perspective in many ways. It's saying, we're all Anzacs, therefore we're all Australians. Well, there's more to the story that I think we need to be aware of. So, in conclusion, We've talked about the strong interaction between the white Australia bureaucracy and the Chinese Australian community. This is the interaction that shaped that community, shaped how they dealt with things, just as it shaped the white Australia bureaucracy as well, settling it down into, as I say, a very ponderous administration, modifying the pattern, but a pattern that had always existed. A pattern we need to remember wasn't only focused on Australia, but was spread around the world, particularly around the Pacific, and focused back in many ways on southern China. We've talked about the impact of falling numbers. That was the main criteria of this particular period before the numbers begin to rise again. And of course, the impact of a growing nationalism, not only Australian nationalism, but a nationalism that allowed people to identify more and more as a Chinese national, as opposed to simply a Chinese person from a particular village or dialect background. And finally, we've reflected on the idea of the impact of the whitewashing of Australian history. How white Australia policy wasn't just about reducing numbers, it was about squeezing a whole range of perspectives out of Australian history and shaping us to believe the Chinese marketer as a gardener stereotype, which in this whole series I've tried to show there's a lot more to Chinese Australian history than that, and a whole range of things that, again, we could talk about at length. If you want to know more, there's some suggested readings here that will go up on the website, the Chinese Australian History website, Society website as well. There's also the text of What Happened to Riley. If you're interested in reading it, I'd recommend people to read that. And I'll just then say thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for this very interesting, topic and the presentation. So many aspects just about, white Australia in relation to Chinese Australians. I've already seen so many questions, and I myself have a few questions. But to be fair, we'll start with the questions coming from most Benjamin. So Benjamin has lots of questions. The first one, it's in relation to the present. In the present COVID climate, do you see a return to that isolationist white Australia attitude a possibility?
Well, that'll be the subject of lecture number 6. I won't come up to it, actually. I'm going to talk about that quite a lot. But yes, unfortunately, yes, it's good to use the word isolationist. Certainly, there seems to be a return to an isolationist idea to some extent as a result of the fears of COVID. Whether it's particularly going to be a white Australia, I don't think it's going to be white Australia, but it's going to be a more narrow kind of thing. And again, a kind of more sense of, again, I mean, the Conservatives in particular have always been trying to define what Australia is, and they're a bit lost. And multiculturalism hasn't allowed people to kind of come up with an easy definition of what an Australian is. So white Australia policy, for all of its defects, it was an easy psychological thing. People knew what a white Australian was. They were just white people, even though there were definitions there that was a bit dodgy. What's an Italian? What's a German? Who fits in? There are various problems. It's even more problematic now, but I think there is a tendency there, but I don't think it's going to get very far. But nevertheless, yes, there is something that we need to be aware of, and there is an underlying psychology there that hasn't disappeared completely. It was embedded quite strongly in the Australia of the period I'm just talking about, and it hasn't disappeared completely.
It's 5 o'clock.
At least it's not as much as we'd hope it would.
Well, that is also the very good reason why we need to know history. So that's a very good question. Second question, also from Benjamin. I had ancestors who occasionally traveled back to China, including one who may not have been able to return to China without finding a substitute to run their shop. What were the restrictions they had on how often they could travel and for how long each period?
There wasn't really any restrictions on the length of time or how many times. It was more to do with making sure their business was identified as being Chinese. So market gardenings or businesses in Chinatown that sold Chinese businesses. It got quite elaborate towards the end of the period, particularly by the 50s and 60s. Cafes, for example, had to have so many Chinese Australian meals and this kind of thing, although early in this period it's not quite so regulated. Nominally, the Dictation Exemption dictations had a 3-year limit on it, but in reality, they were very bureaucratic and you could easily get extensions and so forth, as long as you filled in the form and paid the £1. So it wasn't really, I think the amount of time period people went back and forth was mostly controlled by Chinese customs, the villages themselves. And the pattern seemed to be much the same in the 19th century as it was in the 20th century. And they're very light. People would often stay for about 10 years when they first arrived. That was about the time it took to save money and to send enough money back to allow your parents to find you a wife. And then you went back, got married. And then once you were married, you'd go back every 2 or 3 years. And usually you'd stay in China long enough to make sure that your wife got pregnant. And as soon as she was pregnant, then you'd leave again. I mean, for some people, that pattern is very regular. But of course, there's all kinds of exceptions to the pattern. It wasn't really imposed that much by the bureaucracy, not in Australia anyway, despite what they sometimes would have on the forms. It was more about as long as you had sufficient turnover in your business, or that your business was identified as Chinese in some sense, and therefore you get a substitute. You couldn't get a substitute if the business had nothing to do with Chinese, what was defined as Chinese business.
The next question concerning that the wives of merchants were not allowed to return. My question is like the children were involved as well, included. And the question is when the restrictions were lifted.
Well, again, that's not an easy question. There was no ban. There was no blanket ban on wives or children. It was all a case by case. So there was originally in the legislation allowance specifically for wives of merchants, and that was suspended. But people could always come on a certificate of exemption. And so many wives did come, and many children did come, but they were always allowed to come temporarily. And as I said, sometimes that people were able to weave that into extending their say. Same with students. People could come as a student. You were supposed to go when your studies were finished, but then you could extend those studies or maybe get a job and become an assistant or a substitute yourself. I mean, many people managed to extend these things. So it's not right. It's not possible to say there was a ban that was lifted at some point. I mean, certainly as the White Australia policy is gradually relaxed, then there's more and more people are allowed to come in. And there is a point at which being married, so what happened was that if you were married to a person who was an Australian citizen, a woman would lose her citizenship. So that was a particular law. So women lost their citizenship, which meant that their children, if they were born overseas, then weren't considered to be Australian either. But there were all kinds of inconsistencies there. It's very hard to say there was a ban that was lifted at any particular case. There's always cases of people coming in, recognition of Australian birth, recognition of white wives as opposed to white mothers. I mean, it really depended on, there's a huge amount of discretion, and there's a lot of inconsistency in the files. So you can look at two files and you think the cases seem to be exactly the same. In one case, the wife was allowed in or the children are allowed in. In another case, they're not. And you just think, well, it must have been a bribe or something, because you really can't tell the difference here as to why the decision went one way in one instance and the other way in another. So it's quite confusing, and it's not really as simple as simply saying there was a ban that was lifted at some point. Certainly there was a point at which Chinese Australians or people of Chinese origin could become citizens. That happened very definitely in the 1950s. And then there was a change where women didn't lose their citizenship when they married someone of non-Australian birth, or they could get it back. And that happened gradually in the 1940s.
Yeah, in relation to that, was it common for children and relatives of certificate of exemption holders to be able to stay in Australia, for example, for education purpose? Was it common?
Well, if they were born in Australia, then they could stay as long as they were simply Australians by birth. It wasn't a huge number. There were significant numbers. The number of students that came, so children born in the villages that were then brought to study in Australia, there were hundreds of them. So I haven't really worked out the percentages. It's hard to say, but there were quite a significant number of people who did do that. I mean, education was always very important. I mean, you could obviously send your children to be educated in the village school, and some villages had quite good schools. Other people would send their children to be educated in Guangdong or in Hong Kong, perhaps, but others would bring them to Australia. Sometimes they would go to a school that was really kind of like a visa school, a school where the amount of education was nominal, and really they were skiving off and working in the garden. So you had that kind of level of education. But you also had people going to quite expensive schools in Sydney and Melbourne and being educated quite well, and then returning to China. So it's hard to say exactly what percentage, but it was a significant number. would bring their children to be educated, yes.
Next question, were some of them Chinese exempted from fingerprinting? And if so, what did it signify?
Well, that was a dispute that went on for quite a number of years. So the Chinese consuls in particular were involved in that. They, of course, considered it an affront to have to do the hand printing. They eventually got the hand printing limited to a thumbprint. And then gradually they were able to get exemptions for merchants, or they began to use this term, the superior class. So if you were of a superior class, then you didn't have to have thumbprints, or then passports became more common. And so if you had a passport, a nice official document issued by the Republic of China, then you started to be exempted from that kind of situation. So gradually it got lessened and lessened. But again, it was a case-by-case basis. But there was, by the 1930s, merchants and superior class people were exempted. But by that stage, they were mostly using passports to come in and out rather than just fronting up and hoping to be identified. But people on certificate of exemption, they continued to be have photographs right through the period. And I forget now when fingerprints were gradually stopped being used by the 1940s, I think.
Why did some Australian-born Chinese get a certificate of exemption?
Well, I mean, because this was a very race-based policy, and there was officials. The officials had discretion. So really a lot of it just went on looks. So if you fronted up on a ship, if you decide to go to visit your grandmother in China, and you were born in Australia and you decided to go visit your grandmother in China and you came back and you looked Chinese, you were simply treated as a Chinese person. And the idea that you were Australian, I mean, the officials knew, of course, there were Australian-born Chinese people, but basically you were harassed, and there was a presumption that probably you weren't who you said you were. Particularly if your English wasn't perfect or you spoke with an accent. And sometimes people went back to China when they were quite young and would return to Australia when they were a bit older. And by that stage, they'd either forgotten their English or their English wasn't very good. And so for them to claim they were Australian-born caused difficulties. So to get around, it was just purely a bureaucratic convenience. To get around that, it was easier for them to simply apply for a certificate of exemption, which technically they shouldn't have done. I mean, they weren't really legally, that wasn't legally part of the act any more than endorsing birth certificates. But this was the bureaucracy kind of making do and trying to make the system work. So they were, from the bureaucratic point of view, they were trying to make it easier for Australian-born Chinese. But at the same time, they were trying to make it harder for anyone to pretend to be an Australian-born Chinese who wasn't. And of course, that happened too. People would come from China and say, oh, yes, I was born in Australia, or yes, I've lived here before 1901. And there are all kinds of cases of that happening. So certainly from the customs point of view, they were trying to identify people. And so it was just, as a matter of convenience, easier for some people to take a certificate of exemption from the dictation test, even though they were actually Australian born and in theory had the right to enter Australia freely without that kind of bureaucratic.
Well, obviously there was some strong racist element there. So my question is, was there any protests, from particularly Australian-born Chinese against this?
No, most of the protests seem to come from the Chinese consul and the Nationalist Party. Admittedly, I mean, it's hard to know when I say that. That doesn't mean there weren't Australian-born Chinese behind that thing, but they were using the Chinese consul as their main as their tool. I mean, they were certainly supporting the Chinese consul and giving him information and so forth. So I think there are plenty of Australian-born people protesting, but they didn't often do it directly as a protest. Any kind of formal protest, any kind of letters to the ministers, any kind of confrontation. A couple of confrontations happened at the various ports. Were usually done by the China consul or people who he was working with at the time. So that's why I pointed to the Vivian Chow letter, because he was an Australian-born person who expressed his hostility quite strongly in that writings, but you don't see that very often at the port. There were a couple of people, some merchant people who made a protest and make that, but mainly that was a class protest of being treated, like these market gardeners. There was a big class distinction. So a Chinese merchant who was quite wealthy expected to be treated differently. But nevertheless, they went through the procedure and they got the certificates the same as everybody else. But they didn't expect to be treated quite as badly as, say, a market gardener who was classified as the vegetable class of Chinamen, which was a phrase that was used by some customs people. So class is very important as well, as much as race. But certainly, a look was enough to get you. I mean, certainly, if you look Chinese, then you were mustered. I mean, what happened was when the ship came to port, everybody who looked Chinese had to stand in a group and be inspected. That was the minimum thing that happened. There was no exception to that. And you knew that, if somebody else, a white passenger on that boat, wasn't being subjected to that at all. But people didn't protest. There were no kind of formal protests on that level. These kind of things happen over many, many years. I guess people become to tolerate it. They realise this is the procedure. People's tolerance to some of this behaviour was quite high. From looking at it from a modern perspective, anyway, you wonder why people put up with this, but they did.
I mean, from modern perspective, of course. Yeah, it's really interesting. Next, a question from Harry. For these Chinese came to Australia before 1901 during the gold rush, have any research able to find what kind of arrangements that they may have before they arrive, such as a contract with agents or owner of a gold mining company in Australia, or any sort of like that?
Well, first thing, remember the ones that were here before 1901, they were subject to the Act, weren't gold miners. They'd come long after the gold rush. They were people who'd come to work and to do business, to be market gardeners, to work on a variety of jobs and positions. Relatively few of them would have been. The gold mining period had finished a generation before. These might have been the sons or grandsons of gold miners. So they'd come to Australia to do a variety of things. Tin mining, of course, was one of them. Work scrub cutters, to work as merchants, to take up businesses. So there were a variety of people. But people who were poorer, people who couldn't afford it, would often come, and I've mentioned this in previous lectures, as a kind of credit ticket. And even when they're being smuggled in the 20th century, it's a similar kind of thing. Your money, your cost of passage to arrive in Australia is being paid for by some wealthier person, a storekeeper maybe, or someone who owns a market garden, or perhaps a relative, a wealthier relative, and they're paying for you to arrive. They're paying for you to get on the boat, to come, paying for any smuggling fees, or they're paying your poll tax, whatever it is, and then you have to pay them back. So the arrangements are broadly similar. It's a kind of debt, which means that you're obliged to pay it back. So you work quite hard for the first few years. That's why very often it's 10 years in Australia before people go back for their first trip back to China. Of course, it's 10 years where you have to spend half of it paying back that debt, and then another half, this is very rough estimates, another half saving up enough money to send to your parents, who will then use it to get a good wife for you. I mean no one's going to give their daughter to you in marriage unless you've got a good amount of money or a new house or something. And so you do all that, and then you go back and get married. So yes, this kind of credit ticket debt arrangement is probably the most likely way for people who are coming straight from the village. But of course, by late 19th century, well after the gold rush period, many of the people in the villages are returned overseas Chinese themselves. So they have a bit of money. So you're much more likely to have a relative in the village with a bit of money who can advance you the money. So you may be not using an agent so much, although there are plenty of agents around, but somebody who's an uncle or a cousin or a father who has already come back from overseas and has the money. And one of the things they'll lend the money for is for you, in your turn, to go overseas and carry on the tradition of learning overseas.
Yeah. Harry also asked, where do you find these archived records?
Oh, well, as I said, the whole White Australia policy infrastructure, the whole bureaucracy means there's a huge amount of records in the National Archives. That's for anybody who's still active in Australia after 1901. So anyone who was in Australia before 1901, but travels back and forth, there are lots and lots of files. You can look at the website. I've written up ways of using those files. Many of them are digitized. I mean, you can simply look them up. I mean, you might be lucky and type in, you have an ancestor, you can type in a name, you might even find their file sitting there on the web for you to look at straight away. And so by looking at these, you can get a good idea of the patterning that goes on. But I mean, I mean, obviously it's not as simple as that. I mean, it takes a while to kind of get to know these files and look at them over a period of time. But certainly, I mean, if you're really interested, then of course you've got to look at my book, Returning Home to Glory, which will explain a lot of this and what those files are if you're really interested in doing it. It's available on Hong Kong University Press. But there are other analysis of these of this patterning that goes back and forth as well, and how to find the archives.
Ben is interested, how did the Chinese send the money back? Do they send money back physically carrying back money back, or how did the transfer occur?
Oh, well, I mean, that was yeah, certainly people did do that. They would simply give money to a returning friend or relative. That was very common. These remittance letters were very common. But the most common way, particularly by the beginning of the 20th century, was to use the businesses in Chinatown. So these businesses like the Guangwo Chong in Dixon Street, and some of these businesses that later on, the Wing On and Sincere companies, you would go to their shops in Campbell Street or in Dixon Street, and then you would hand the money over, and they would write a letter for you if you couldn't write. They'd write a letter and they'd take your money. They take a percentage. They take maybe about 10% as a fee, and then they would ensure the money would go back. And they would also exchange the money. So your money would be in British pounds, Australian pounds being used. It would be converted to Hong Kong dollars or into Mexican dollars in China. And then your wife or your mother or whoever it was could go to the remittance store and pick that up. Or there are even letter carriers that would carry the money and the letter to the village, to the house, and hand the money over to your wife. And then you could, they could then go to the shop where again the wife could get a letter written for her, and she would then tell the husband what they're doing with the money or whatever, what's happening, and then the money would go back, and you go back to that store in Campbell Street or wherever and pick up a return letter that would tell you that the money had arrived safely. So it was quite an involved system that worked quite well. And again, this is written about in various analyses. And that. But it could be an informal system too, where people would just send money back. There are stories from the gold rush period of people carrying little satchels of gold dust on their belt and taking them back to be distributed to the families. But that was a bit dangerous, and you could lose all your gold that way. So using the stores was safer as far as the market gardeners and others, the poorer people were concerned. The hard-earned money, you needed to make sure it got back safely.
Well, the trust is incredible, compared with what's happening today. I would like to ask one question for myself. You mentioned the Huaqiao pattern, which is quite interesting, like sending money back, donating to the village and to set up schools and then return with glory, this pattern. Do you see the same pattern in other migrant groups? Other than Chinese migrant groups?
Yes. Well, yes. I did a comparison with the Italians, and you find, and there are other migrant groups, Italians, Greeks, and others that similar patterns. The Italians was probably the closest, particularly of the late 19th, early 20th century. So a very similar pattern of people from poorer villages sending their men out to travel to work in America or Australia, returning after a number of years. But the difference was the Italians weren't so successful in re-establishing themselves in the village when they returned. So the main characteristic of the Chinese was that they could return to their village and retire there, and were accepted and became prominent people within their village. I mean, there were scandals and there were problems, of course, and things happened. But by and large, with the Italians, when they would go back with money, they weren't accepted in the village anymore. They were there was hostility, and very quickly they tended to move out of their home village and move into a bigger town, or simply return to Australia permanently and take their wives with them. So the continuing pattern that existed over so many generations is very strong within Chinese. And although there are comparisons with other migrant groups, it's not quite as strong as it is with the Chinese. Of course, Filipinos have a very strong pattern of this kind of remittance earnings in more modern times, and there are certainly other groups where there are comparisons. But I think for the Chinese, or the Southern Chinese anyway, it's certainly a very intense pattern and one that's sustained over many, many generations.
Rick has a question. When talking about the Chinese Australian history, do you use Cantonese or Mandarin usage and pronunciation?
Well, that's always an argument. I personally always use, well, I use characters, but I usually have a glossary at the back of the book where I give all the Cantonese Cantonese pronunciations as well. And I try to use the Cantonese pronunciation, or even, of course, even using the older romanizations, because it's not just Cantonese. I mean, for example, the people that I mostly have looked at as Zhongshan people who come from places like Lungdu. Well, Lungdu has its own language, which isn't Cantonese, and their own pronunciation. And there are variations in the Cantonese pronunciation as well. Taishan people, Taishan is a separate language from Cantonese. So it's not just about being Cantonese or Mandarin, it's about being using the local or the dialect and language of the people of the time. So we try to keep, or I try to keep faithful to those, simply because the criteria being the pronunciation that the people themselves used, rather than an artificial conversion to a modern dialect such as Mandarin, which most of these people, certainly in the 19th and early 20th century, didn't speak at all. But for simplicity's sake, of course, often the glossary will have a pinyin variation as well, or simply the characters so people can read the characters as it is. But I think it's important to try and identify the dialect, because it was very important to the people at the time. But it shouldn't be simplified as simply being Cantonese versus Mandarin. It's more than that. I mean, people go on about, oh, Mandarin has taken over Cantonese. Well, Cantonese has already taken over Taishanese and Lungdu. I mean, languages tend to dominate, and Cantonese is just as kind of suppressing other languages as Mandarin is now. It's not necessarily a political thing. It's simply the nature of languages, of people just try and speak a uniform language, just as most of this history, as far as I'm concerned, is written in English, which is, of course, an imperial language, which has taken over many other languages. And we have to, of course, deal with that, but try in the history to bring out the language people actually spoke, which in this instance is quite a number of different dialects and languages, even just within southern China.
Well, the most relevant question is the next one from Wanning, and I have the same question. What is a Dao law? You know, Diaoluo.
Diaolu, the tower houses, the gun towers. Is that what you mean?
Diaoluo.
Diaolu. Yeah.
Is that Mandarin or Cantonese?
That's probably, that's similar in both Mandarin and Cantonese. Though my pronunciation might be very, very good, but it's certainly in Mandarin it's just Diaolu. So the gun towers, that's the Cantonese term, using that to call them gun towers, but in reality they were originally watchtowers or gun towers, and then they developed or evolved into a sometimes they were for a whole village to take refuge in, other times they were just simply a family tower, and the family would live there. I even saw one tower with quite elaborate, a very wealthy merchant. He had 5 wives and had a wife on every floor of the tower. The low-ranking wife was on the top because she had to go up the stairs, and the principal wife was on the bottom, so she could didn't have to walk up so many stairs. So yeah, I mean it's a historical term, but in reality, and they varied a lot from different places too. The ones in Zhongshan, for example, are relatively simple. The ones in Kaiping are very elaborate, and they're the ones that have been World Heritage nominated.
From Christy. Christy says, so what was the process for remittances in country New South Wales? Was everything funneled through Sydney first?
Yes, it all had to go through Sydney from New South Wales. Well, unless you were in northern New South Wales, then it could go through Brisbane. But of course, it was all going by ship. So you had to. So if you wanted to send things through, you'd use a store, and the stores were networked. I mean, the stores in New South Wales were all branches and networks of stores with Sydney links. Everybody had to have a link with Sydney or Brisbane, partly to get their goods, but also, of course, to send remittances back. They would go through the Sydney stores, and then from there, they'd go back. And the same when you were traveling. If you wanted to go back to China, you would travel to Sydney, and very often you would spend maybe a night or two or more waiting for a ship. You would spend it in the dormitories that were often located within these stores. Again, the Gong Wo Chong, which is 84 Dixon Street, one of the last of the buildings left in Sydney, had them dormitory rooms in the top, and people could stay there overnight or longer if necessary before taking a ship, because the ships were usually come only once a week. So you arrive in Sydney, you might have to spend a bit of time waiting for your ship. So yes, so remittances and transport. Sydney was very important. It was very much the hub of a network around New South Wales, as was Brisbane and Melbourne.
Harry has a question to ask whether they can receive a copy of a PPT. But I know that you have, we recorded this session, so you can always look at the session. And yeah, so every slide is in recording.
It'll all be part of the recording, yeah. So just view it on the site, including the previous lectures as well as
all recorded there. That's right. So you can always go back and to watch and listen. And Kate said, great session. And she has a question: what a place, if any, did the white Australian policy play in the Japanese riots during the mid-1920s in several pearling towns, across northern Australia, like Darwin or Broome? Was it about policy or about the Japanese behaviour?
It's hard to say. I mean, certainly the White Australia policy would have played a part, because what it did in the pearling industry was it categorised people by race, and it kept the races very separate. I mean, again, it was a bureaucratic thing. So they kind of, meant that the Japanese pearling crews did certain things, and Filipinos did something else, and the Chinese did something else. I mean, they all had to kind of fit within this policy. And so it did tend to exacerbate some of the tensions, but exactly what causes race riots and things. I mean, you can, certainly the White Australia policy was part of it. You can't say it had nothing to do with it, but by and large, there was a sense that, I mean, the Chinese were being seen more and more to be aggressors, particularly from the Chinese point of view, and the Japanese in the pearling areas were sent to be the elite because they were the divers. And so they often acted, or accused of acting, very arrogantly and so forth. And how true that is, I don't know, but I know that that were the accusations and so forth, that they were kind of felt that they were better than others. And certainly they got better conditions because the Chinese embassy went into bat for them right from the beginning of the White Australia policy. The Chinese Empire and the Chinese consul, the Japanese consuls and Japanese Empire pushed and pressured the Australian government a lot to make sure that Japanese got a better deal, and they by and large did. And so the Chinese would have resented that because the Chinese consuls didn't have the same influence, certainly not in the early days. And the Japanese consuls are pressuring the Australians because they're pressuring the British. The Japanese Empire was for quite a while ally of the British, and so they would write directly to Britain and get Britain to put pressure on Australia. And so the Japanese got treated a little bit better for quite a while. And the Chinese would have been aware of that, of course, and that would have caused resentment, even apart from what Japan was beginning to do more and more in China itself.
So in relation to that, did Japanese business, and other interesting fishing and pearling industries, did they see themselves more aligned to white Australian policy view on Chinese? So they see them like more superior to Chinese?
Yes, I mean, that was interesting. The Japanese were very intent upon not being treated the same as Chinese. That was one of the big arguments that they made, was they said, well, look, we accept, I mean, people toleration of racism was quite, we accept that Australia has the right to limit who's going to come to Australia. And we have no intention of bringing in, wanting free, open migration of Japanese people. We just simply want enough to come in to work the pearling, to do plantation work. We want our merchants to be free. But what we don't want is for you to say, this is the White Australia policy, for you to say that we should be treated the same as Chinese. So we want it to be different. And one of the major changes that they did manage to get was the Dictation Test, which was originally said to be in any European language, was changed specifically for the Japanese to be, the Dictation Test could be given in any prescribed language. Technically, this made no difference whatsoever. The test was given in exactly the same European language as it always was. But the loophole was meant to be that normally it could be given in a non-European language, which is, say, Japanese. And for the Japanese, that meant that it was no longer a matter of Europeans versus the rest. It was like the world. And if Australia wanted to treat Japanese differently from Chinese, that was okay, as long as Japanese weren't lumped in together. So it was very much a race argument from the Japanese point of view. And they were very keen not to be seen to be the same. And again, Chinese knew this, of course, and were quite resentful about that as well.
A separate question from me is, you mentioned assimilation, and do you have a statistics for the percentage of Chinese being assimilated through intermarriage and all sorts? And also, do those people who are assimilated would like to identify themselves as Australian, nothing to do with Chinese, or the other way around?
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. That's part of the change that's happening, of course. We don't really have any statistics. What we do know, though, is if you look at the birth certificates and look through them very carefully, the number of people who do have some Chinese ancestry is much, much higher than you might think, particularly in Queensland and other parts of New South Wales. I mean, there are a lot of Chinese men floating around, and whether they were common law marriages or formal marriages, there were a lot of births taking place, and a lot of people do have some Chinese ancestry. But that was either hidden or, as I say, people just simply assimilated. And so certainly people today are finding Chinese ancestors in their family tree. Up in the 60s and 70s, when that was discovered, people were often horrified. It was similar to finding a convict ancestor. People didn't want to know about it. Nowadays, it's much more likely people want to know about it and are very interested. And so quite a lot of people make inquiries trying to find out more about their Chinese ancestors. And unfortunately, very often, because of that assimilation, because of that veil of secrecy that happened in a particular generation, they often don't know very much. They're very lucky if they have a name. The name is just in some Romanized form. They don't have characters. If they're lucky, they might have a bit more information. Some people are very lucky if their ancestor left a big paper trail, or usually a merchant who has businesses, then they can find out quite a lot. But most people don't really have a lot of information, but they are increasingly much more interested and want to find out as much as they can about that, because things have changed. Australia is no longer as narrowly white as it once was, and so people accept the idea. Some people go to the other extreme. They find they have a Chinese ancestor and they go all Chinese and decide that they're Chinese, and they go off to try and visit a village and try and find out as much as they can about Chinese culture, even though they weren't particularly brought up in that way. I mean, people will take these things in various ways, but certainly it's true that a lot more people do have some Chinese ancestry than might be than they might think. If they do a lot more DNA tests, they probably find that out.
From Ken, for contemporary perceptions of Chinese, you mentioned hardworking Chinese and nationalistic Anzac soldiers as the two main ones. Is it there a return of the yellow horde mentality that sees China or Chinese as influencing Australian foreign influence in a bad way?
Well, possibly. I mean, certainly this is mixed up, of course, with the rise of China itself as a great power, and unfortunately, there is still a large percentage of Australians who are fairly ignorant of the diversity of Chinese, and who don't realise that there are many Chinese people who, of course, aren't born in China, aren't Chinese nationals, never were, and are quite separate, as well as people born in Australia and have different views and different ideas. So they tend to lump things together. But this is all mixed up with a lot of other attitudes as well. So you've got the rise of China as a power, but then you've got people are so ignorant they can't even tell the difference between Chinese people and Asian people generally. So you're tending to get a rise of the Asian Australian idea and kind of lumping people together as Asians. And this is a more, not necessarily a negative idea. In fact, in many ways, it has an advantage, but because it just simply sees that there's a diversity within Australia, which makes it harder, I think, to return to any of this very hardcore yellow peril idea. I mean, in the period I was talking about in the 20s and 30s, people would unashamedly look at someone who looked Chinese and just simply make all kinds of assumptions about them, regardless. Nowadays, if you do that, you're likely to find yourself in big trouble, because you're just not going to. It's just not going to be true. You just have no idea what a person who looks Chinese what their background might be, and how Australian born or otherwise they are, what their relationship to China, and this has to penetrate. Because the other big difference is that people of Chinese heritage in Australia are far more middle class. You can get away with a lot of stuff back in the 20s and 30s because most Chinese of Chinese heritage were working class, and people habitually treated people working class back much harsher, and they were forced to tolerate an attitude which we wouldn't tolerate today. Middle class people, of course, don't tolerate that kind of thing, and so there's no matter if there is a tendency to try and be anti-Chinese in Australia, it's going to get, we're just getting a lot more pushback. You can't get away with very much without a big pushback and without people flaring up about it. And that's all to the good, of course. It helps make any kind of that kind of animosity or any kind of that one-sided bias or racism very much a minority thing. And I don't think it's got much chance of developing anywhere near to the extent it existed in previous generations. At least certainly that's my hope. And I think that's one of the lessons of history anyway. So things are not, I mean, things can be the same. We look a lot from history, but it's not always the same. There are differences.
Kate has a following on question about Japanese 1930s and the 20s and 30s. Was it because of their maritime industries, you know, across Northern Australia, what they were doing, pearling fishing, was seen as a higher status than what was perceived as a Chinese, you know, professions like marketer gardeners?
Oh, no, I don't think so. I mean, most people didn't know much about the pearling. In those pearling communities, the divers had more respect, and most of the divers were Japanese. But there were other Japanese working in other areas. Not many. I mean, the Japanese were nowhere near the numbers of Chinese people. I don't think there was that much division. I mean, people, apart from the divers, by the 20s and 30s, most Japanese in Australia were only a few merchants. And so they had more status, and of course they were merchants and wealthier. Whereas Chinese, you had, of course, merchants who were wealthier, but you had a much larger number of people who were doing a more diverse range of work as market gardeners, whatever. And that's where the status comes in, the perception of who people are. With the pearling industry, well, not all divers were Japanese either. Many of them were from the Philippines or from Indonesia, what's now Indonesia. And the islands and so forth. And the Chinese were very important in the pearling industry as well. They may not have been divers, but many of them owned the luggers or they ran the businesses, and they also did the buying and selling of the pearl shells and the storage and so forth. So the Chinese were very important in the pearl shelling industry, even if they weren't actually divers very much, excuse me, at all.
I suppose you answered a part of this question, still Kate's question. Why was pearling an exception regarding labor force employment? Did this contribute to increasing localized union unrest against the Japanese workers in a different way to how Chinese were perceived?
No, it wasn't. The reason why the pearling industry was an exception was because they just couldn't get white people to do the work. It was just too hard. So in various industries, they did try. They did bring in all kinds of things to try and recruit white divers to try and eliminate it. If they could have, they would have. They would have eliminated any non-white workers from any of these industries if they could. But they just couldn't get people willing to do that kind of hard work. Able to it's very dangerous work and a very high mortality rate. I mean, many of these Japanese divers came from poor fishing villages in Japan. Again, like people coming from villages in China, they were doing it because of the money, because they could support their families. But many of them never returned. I mean, the cemeteries of Broome and so on are littered with the dead, the remains of the divers. So yes, it was just purely a matter of convenience. You know, if they could have, they would have made all the pearling industry done by white workers, as they tried to do with other industries, and they just couldn't get away with it. And so they just had to accept a higher level of non-white workers coming through the White Australia policy. They didn't like it. I mean, you can see in the administration that they resisted it whenever they could. They tried to make it hard for people. They tried to make sure that the people were returned once their labour contracts were finished. There was a lot of making sure that people returned, didn't stay in Australia. A lot of the bureaucracies about that, arguments about sending people away, or if you lost your job as a diver for whatever reason, you're meant to leave Australia as soon as possible. So they were very concerned to make sure that people didn't stay. But they did have to accept that the work was going to be done by people who were not white for that reason. They couldn't get the workers to do it.
Well, there are reasons behind every sort of a circumstance. This is so fascinating. Ling has a question concerning her family. My grandmother was Australian born and her husband was born in China. 2 of her 7 children were born in Hong Kong in mid-1930s. according to copies of her documents, she was told that they had to return these two children to Australia in a certain time frame before they turned 3 years old. Would this have been due to white Australian policy?
Yes, I mean, that's interesting. I would like to see that kind of document, because that kind of policy is very inconsistent. It's very hard to say. There were these high court decisions that were made at one point, which basically said you could lose your citizenship, even if you were Australian born, if you spent too much time outside of Australia. But this wasn't consistently applied, and so it's very hard to see in the official documents a pattern like that. So I've never come across a document where they told people they had to return within 3 years. That may relate more to the civic exemption, but certainly it was part of the White Australia policy. Yes, it was about people having their right to re-enter Australia or to claim their Australian citizenship. Though in those circumstances, if they were born in Hong Kong, the mother, although she was Australian born, by marrying someone who was not Australian citizen, would have lost her citizenship anyway. So the whole family was not Australian citizens, except for the children that were actually born in Australia. At least that's technically it. But again, the files are often very inconsistent. And it's very hard to know exactly which way they're going. I'd like to, I wouldn't mind having a look at that file to try and figure out exactly what they meant by saying they had to come back within 3 years. I've never seen anything exactly like that. It may have been simply that it was about to expire. The certificate of exemption did expire in theory after 3 years, but in reality, people let them expire and they just got them renewed again. It may be that, but that doesn't sound appropriate for children. But by and large, that didn't mean anything. The 3 year limit, it just because they would simply renew it on payment of a £1 fee. Most cases, anyway.
Right. Question from Ian. Michael, you said Chinese nationalism and sense of Chineseness emerged particularly in response to Japanese imperialism, which would be the 1930s. Wasn't it already an important trend in the Republican era a few decades earlier?
Well, as far as the Kuomintang were concerned, yes, they were trying to beat it up. But that doesn't mean it was necessarily true among everybody. I think you found people who weren't always as concerned. There were those who were quite keen to see the Republic and did begin to think of themselves as Chinese. But I think for a lot of people, they were quite indifferent until the Japanese encroachments began to kind of make it seem more of a threat, and people began to get more concerned about it. So I mean, it's very hard to identify these things and say, oh, it's definitely this way and that way. But I wouldn't necessarily take Kuomintang propaganda, nationalist propaganda, as the key to how people thought of themselves. I mean, I know the Nationalist Party, and that's what I call themselves, the Nationalist Party, are very keen to make all Chinese think of themselves as Chinese, because that's part of being loyal to the party, part of being how they were going to. I mean, they were fighting to get dominance over China in the 1920s. So naturally, they emphasised the Chineseness of everybody. In order to enhance their party's rule. But that doesn't mean that everybody was necessarily going along with that. And again, it was a generational thing. I mean, obviously younger people born in that period, yes. Older people, maybe not. But again, it's very hard to be definitive about that. But certainly with the encroachments of Japan, you find people starting to really get involved, form groups, again, with the Nationalist Party behind it. Form groups to emphasise the need for China to defend itself against the encroachments of the Japanese Empire. And of course, naturally, that enhances a sense of being Chinese as opposed to merely being from a particular village or dialect or whatever. But nevertheless, people's identity on that basis was very strong and continued to be very strong. I mean, people didn't let their daughters marry anybody, even as late as the 1950s and 60s. If you were from Zhongshan and my daughter was from Taishan, you're not getting married. They might all be Chinese and they might well hate the Japanese, but that didn't mean you're going to marry my daughter. I mean, so the sense of identity was worked on a variety of levels, and I think we need to be aware of that as much as we can, given the evidence we have.
Christy has a very specific question for you. She said there are also examples of children born in Australia with a Chinese ancestry who were, who went to China but were not allowed back into Australia because they've been out of the country for more than 10 years. There was also a famous example, this is a question. There was also a famous example of a man who was born with an Australian who had a British ancestry, who was not permitted back into Australia in the 30s and the 40s because he had forgotten to speak English. Do you know the name of the person Christy is talking about?
There's more than one case like that, actually. That wasn't as uncommon as you might think. So as I said, there was a High Court ruling that did specifically say you could lose your citizenship nominally. But the funny thing is that wasn't, I mean, the customs officials kind of conveniently forgot that. I mean, so certainly there are cases where people were being told, oh, you've been away too long. But then you've got cases the next year where they've been allowed in. Oh, yes, these people are Australian born. I think for the customs officials, the idea of being Australian born was in people's heads that it did mean something despite the High Court ruling. So the High Court ruling wasn't like High Courts in Australia aren't the same as the Supreme Court in America. It didn't change the Constitution. It didn't make for a law that people had to follow. So while there are instances of people being told, yes, you can't come back to Australia because you've been away too long, there are plenty of instances where that's no problem at all. And that included people who had forgotten their English. Yes, so quite a number of people who were born in Australia, taken back to the village, grew up in the villages or in Shanghai, wherever, and then came back to Australia. And some of them, some of them were mixed race. Their parents, their mothers might well have been white. And so they didn't necessarily look very Chinese. So there are quite a number of cases of people who didn't look Chinese at all, spoke only Chinese, and then arrived in at customs and said, well, you know, I'm Australian born, you got to let me in. And saying that presumably in very broken English. And so this caused a lot of trouble with the customs who didn't know what to do. And so there were identifications, there was all kinds of rigmaroles going on. And there was quite a number of cases like that, but instances of them, yes, they were allowed in, and others weren't. Again, some cases, the reason why some were and some weren't is very hard to determine. There are also instances of people who weren't Chinese at all, but were adopted by a Chinese family, and either grew up in Australia with knowing Chinese, Cantonese anyway, or who were, in a couple of instances, taken back to the village and grew up there and came back. So they were Chinese by family, by their thinking, but genetically weren't Chinese at all. There's a few instances of that. The most famous, of course, was Senator Backup in Tasmania, Tasmanian senator, who was not of Chinese origin, but was an orphan who was adopted by a Chinese family, and including the name Backup, which was a rather strange Chinese name, but nevertheless the one that he used.
Question from Juanita. Thanks, Michael, for a thoughtful talk. You are the best yet, I think. So Juanita is curious to know how you got the figure of 2,000 Chinese buried between 1900 to 1940.
Oh, well, that's in a secret document that's buried away in the archives of Rookwood Cemetery. We're trying to dig it out of them. I mean, Juanita will know that she's been doing good work with the state archives. I'm also negotiating with the state archives. So this is a document that was in originally Rookwood Cemetery, like many cemeteries in Australia, were divided into sections by religion. So the Anglican section was given control of the Chinese section. So Rookwood has a very large Chinese section, and they had a nice book, a nice big thick book, where they recorded every single burial in that cemetery. And I've seen the book, and I've gone through it all and added them all up. So I've got the statistics from that one cemetery. That's Rookwood Cemetery, so it's the main cemetery in Sydney. It does include regional New South Wales. And I've added up all the burials from the 1870s through to 1940s that were recorded in that book. Unfortunately, that book isn't available at the moment for other people to look at because, as I say, the Rookwood Cemetery Trust has taken over the Anglican Trust, and they've taken over the archives, and they haven't seen fit to make that accessible just yet. But the state archives, as I know, I'm aware of, is negotiating to make that book at least digitize it, or maybe make it transferred into the state archives where other historians can look at it. But that records all burials in Rookwood Cemetery from and returns to China in red pencil, red ink through each one that's done is a marking that says return to China. So you can calculate not only how many burials there are, but also how many were actually dug up and returned to China. And that's all recorded in my book as well, based on that one particular archive. It's quite a lovely source, and hopefully it'll be more available soon. So that's where I get the figures from. And you can welcome Juanita to go and add them up yourself when the book becomes accessible.
Dinah is asking, in your next talk, perhaps, are you going to discussing Chinese men marrying white Australian women?
Probably not, partly because that's been done quite a lot by Kate Bagwell and some others, and Sandy Robb. I did mention it in my last lecture a bit, mostly in terms of statistics. And so that a lot of those marriages have already taken place in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Of course, it continues on, of course, right through the period. There are that. So I'll mention them in passing, but I won't go into great detail because it is a fascinating topic. But there is quite a lot. And if you look at my suggested readings that I put up on the topic, you'll find I did mention at least one, maybe two articles that specifically on that topic. Sandy Robb has recently done a PhD on wives and families in Queensland. Very, very fascinating PhD, which is online. People can read that. Of course, Kate Bagwell has done a lot of work on that. And there are a number of other writings as well. But again, it's one of those topics that this is a very general overview, and so I can't go into great detail on very specific topics, but I certainly like to. And certainly it's very important. That's why I mentioned women in the villages, and particularly because, again, that's where most of the women were, women within these family groups. Marriages in Australia, of course, the ABCs, again, very important in terms of people's choice, and these were very often mixed race people. People with mostly, not always, but often with white mothers. And the boys were identified, like Billy Singh was part Chinese. You can see he didn't look 100% Chinese, but enough to be identified as Chinese, but he himself chose not to be involved with the Chinese community. We don't know really how many people that were in that situation who simply lived life in Australia without much regard for the wider Chinese community linking in. But we know there were people who changed over their lifetime. They might have grown up in a group where they were the only Chinese family, and then decided to move to a place like Sydney, where suddenly they found themselves part of a wider Chinese community. There are examples of people doing that, for example.
A couple of more questions, Michael. We're getting there. You can see so many people are so interested in asking all these questions. One is from Philip. Was there any central monitoring or surveillance of Chinese migrants across states pre-Federation?
Not really. Pre-Federation, they were mostly involved in their poll taxes. It was interesting. There was a case, for example, the Victoria-New South Wales border was interesting. There was a poll tax, of course, but what you had was, of course, the border, like the border is today, if you try and shut the border between New South Wales and Victoria, you cause a lot of trouble, as we know now with COVID at the moment. It was similar. And so when New South Wales introduced its poll tax, which was higher than the Victorian one at first, there was allowances made. There were Chinese men living on the New South Wales border who worked in Victoria. They would come across and do the grape picking or come across and do gardening. And the customs people on that border let them without making them pay the poll tax. On the other hand, if you were a Chinese person who came down from Sydney that they didn't know, then you're supposed to pay the poll tax. And when someone was a bit over officious and started trying to block people from crossing the border, the Victorians complained and said, "What are you doing stopping our Chinese from coming across? We need them to do workers." So people were fairly flexible. There wasn't monitoring. There was a little bit, again, New South Wales was because it had so many borders with other states. There was an interesting example of monitoring of the New South Wales Queensland border at one point in the late 19th century. Again, New South Wales had a poll tax that was higher than the Queensland poll tax. And there was a sense that people were being smuggled across the Queensland border. And so they would send customs officials up to try and monitor what was going on at Warwick and so forth. But it was usually on a case-by-case basis, usually when something flared up, when they suddenly caught somebody and they had to do a bit of investigation. So a little bit of toing and froing going on. But by and large, it was more for show. It would suddenly blow up and it would be in the newspapers and some politician would get involved. So they'd send somebody off and then it would all die down again and just be a bit inflexible. I mean, really, we don't know how many people end up paying these poll taxes. When we go on about the poll tax, the £10 poll tax in New South Wales in the 1860s, from some records, virtually nobody paid that tax. I mean, it's a big thing in the history. The poll tax, very discriminatory, blah, blah, blah. But Did anyone actually pay it? Maybe 6 people in any one year, according to some records. We're not really sure. So again, and same certainly the Queensland one. Again, we know they introduced various poll taxes in the 1870s. So as you know, it was just a paper law, and it actually had no effect whatsoever on what was happening. So you can kind of look for what's happening and monitoring and so forth, but a lot of it was very lackadaisical and more about politics than it was about actual impact. It was just only after 1901 with Gatley Hunt and the real White Australia bureaucracy really got keyed up. That was quite an enormous bureaucracy, but again, it was bureaucratic. It tended to kind of grind along very slowly, and if you oiled the wheels and if you abided by their rather tiresome procedures, you could do what you wanted to do to a large extent. And that's certainly what we find with the patterning that went on.
Second last one, Gil said, at what time did it become known that the White Australian policy would be enacted? Did this change behavior in terms of returning or not returning to Canton? It seems that there was no detrimental to returning, as they had the right to return to Australia. Yeah,
it's that's an interesting question. There were when the poll tax was introduced in New South Wales in 1888, where it was increased from £10 to £100. There was perceived to be a sudden rush of people coming in to try and avoid it when they knew that was coming in. Whether that was true or not, or whether people were just coming in anyway, it's a bit hard to say. In 1901, there didn't seem to be any of that kind of toing and froing. I think there was a fair bit of, that was because there was a fair bit of confusion about the whole thing. I mean, it was called a dictation test, an education test, and nobody actually knew what that meant. So they knew that the law that was introduced wasn't saying no Chinese, which previous state colonial acts had been specifically about Chinese. This dictation test doesn't mention Chinese at all. It's just an Immigration Restriction Act introducing an education test. And at first it seemed like that was going to be a real thing, that they would actually make people read a book, and some of the colonies had introduced education tests before, and didn't realise what was happening. So it kind of came in, I suppose, a bit more gradually than it looks like with hindsight. And so I don't think people knew what was happening. The real panic set in a year later when it looked like the domicile regulations were suddenly going to be enforced very strictly and narrowly, and then there was a panic. And at that stage, the thing was that all the gardeners are putting off going home. They're afraid to go home because they think if they do, they won't be able to come back. So there was a hint of that, but again, it all happened in a relatively short period of time, a number of months, maybe a year. And so whether there was it's hard to tell in the statistics whether there's any obvious variation numbers going back. There's no clear evidence of that, but the people are saying in letters, oh, they're not going home, they're afraid. But people did. There were certainly people who did go back, and then they had to write letters saying, well, I went back before you changed the law, and can I come back in anyway? And they were. The bureaucracy said, yeah, sure. I mean, if you can prove to us that you are who you are, that you were here before 1901, even though you don't have a certificate, you never got it, you left before it came in, it's okay. They recognised that was okay. So in some ways, the bureaucracy was bureaucratic. It just allowed you to do, if you met the criteria, then you're okay. So they weren't too bloody minded about it most of the time, although occasionally there's certainly instances of that happening.
I'll have the last question myself. You mentioned, contemporary change of mind or change of perception, looking at the Chinese Australian history. One is seeing that as victims, and the other is more like a nationalist. And were they more from historians' point of view, or were they reflection of actually Chinese Australian people?
Yes, I mean, I think this is much more a reflection of people, not so, well, Chinese Australians, necessarily family historians, people kind